Hey there folks, and welcome back to another Let's Talk About video where I discuss and kind of review other games I've been playing. Today we're going to be talking about Scars Above, a third-person shooter game developed by Madhead Games and published by Prime Matter. But before we get into that, really quick, we do have to thank today's sponsor. Weird, right? This video is sponsored by G Fuel. You can support yourself with an energy drink mix that's packed with so many vitamins that Flintstone Gummies would just be jealous about. You can support me by supporting you when you use my creator code FEM to get 20% off at the checkout. Alright, so Scars Above. Now, I know a lot of people looking at the trailers and such of this game probably came to a similar conclusion that I did, and that it looked kind of like Remnant. Am I right? I loved Remnant, which is why I wanted to give Scars Above a shot, because, I mean, who knows, it could be another diamond in the rough, right? Good news and bad news is that it's not like Remnant at all, and those correlations shouldn't be considered, and it's actually standing on its own very well, and is actually a welcome surprise. So, let's just get into what makes Scars Above unique. First, I'd like to point out the visuals are pretty nice in this game. Maybe not the most pristine textures I've seen, but the art direction is definitely on point. One of my biggest critiques of games these days, and I bring it up every time, is that they just don't do lighting right. I'm a really big stickler for lighting, and I'm glad to say that, yeah, here in Scars Above, the lighting is great. It's atmospheric, and in general, the visuals are just quite pleasing. It was giving me some Returnal vibes for sure, but I mean, I'll take it. Tacking onto the visuals, I want to talk about the frame rate, because that's also a big part of how games feel. And again, pleased to tell you, the game runs flawlessly. Not once had I crashed, stuttered, lost frames, none of that stuff, which is huge because a lot of PC games these days have terrible stuttering issues and frame skips, drops, crashes, just general performance of PC games these days have not been good. So when games like this come out and I don't have any issue, it really just stands out to me. Now, some of the animations are a little stiff at times, and when I first started Scars Above, the main character felt weird to control because the animations didn't quite line up to what I was expecting the game to feel like, if that makes sense. It looks a little floaty, where it felt like it should have been much heavier and slower, but honestly, that's pretty much the only issue I had with like the animations and visually, but I kind of got over it rather quick. Adding on to more visuals, the enemy design is actually on point, in that enemies are, one, a very good indicator of what to expect in an encounter, which I think deserves to be praised. Brutes do a lot of ground pounds and shockwaves, dogs dash and sprint, big mouth enemies want to hug you, and yeah, it gives you an idea of what to expect in combat, but I'll touch more on combat in a little bit. But also, too, the enemy designs can be quite terrifying, and mostly these guys. They just scream and charge, and yeah, I don't like them. It reminds me of the Yetis from the original Quake, but I think it marks for a good enemy design since it can elicit that kind of reaction, and you don't get that all the time. So, kudos on the enemy design and the art direction all around. All in all, the presentation is pretty solid. Next, though, I want to move on to the gameplay and the campaign, which is the general gist of the game, right? As I mentioned, I thought this was going to play and feel a lot like Remnant, and it's actually not that. Scars Above is very much a narrative-driven experience and somewhat linear. There aren't really any significant RPG elements to the game like Remnant has. You can find knowledge, which is XP, to buy some perks and go through the game, but that's pretty much it. There's no armors, accessories, or anything really equipable. What you can find through some of the exploration, though, are weapon upgrades, which grant you new features like increased clip size or alternate firing methods, which honestly, I think is fine enough to justify the exploration because you never know when you're going to find another upgrade. But it's definitely not an RPG or have any of those elements, and the damage numbers don't really change at all unless you get the one perk that boosts damage. So honestly, I feel like the damage numbers there are just like for a formality so you can see when you hit a weak spot on an enemy. But from the trailers and such, I totally see why myself and others thought this was going to be like Remnant and be more RPG and like damage numbers focused and all that stuff. It's not. It has no RPG tropes. Now, regarding the story-driven aspect, I'm not going to spoil the story at all because as a story game, that's half the experience. I will say, though, there are a few twists and turns, and it's engaging enough that I didn't mind sitting through all the cutscene and dialogue, and trust me, I rarely sit through the cutscene and dialogue. Speaking of the cutscenes, though, they are really weird in this game. A lot of the time, they don't match up like where the player was at the start and the end of the cutscene when they start playing. They also just like pop in bosses and enemies with no indicator after the cutscene that didn't even include them. So like it's really weird. Most of the times, the cutscenes just don't fit in, and they visually look very different from the game. So all the cutscenes are kind of awkward. And that's one of my gripes with the game for sure. It's a minor gripe. It's just, cutscene transitions weird, but it's a gripe. Let's move on to the meat and potatoes, though, which is the gameplay. As a minor note to the gameplay in Scars Above, they have that feature that a lot of puzzle games have where you can examine items in areas to gain more information about topics and artifacts, which doesn't seem like it fits in a shooter game, but I actually really like this stuff a lot. It's the little things like this that really make games stand out to me because it's just that little extra bit of effort. because rather than just have like a static image of something you can pick up, you could just rotate these and play around with the object and use extra info from the objects to solve puzzles. And it leaves it entirely up to the player to discover, which I like, because that's just another little interactive part. Scars Above also has a rather unique take on gunplay, which is one of the reasons why I really like this game. So there's technically only one gun in the game, but you pick up tech from your crashed ship and enemies to alter your weapon to do different things. Basically, this gun can be altered to have one of 4 elements: shock, fire, ice, and acid. Each monster has certain weaknesses and weak spots that you need to shoot with corresponding elements, but there's much more to it than that. Like, enemies in the water or out during the rain become wet, which reduces fire damage taken, even on their weak spot if it was a fire spot, and increases their lightning damage taken, or makes them more freezable, which you can then chain like lightning damage onto other wet enemies and stuff like that. You can also combine elemental effects, like freezing enemies that are wet, or exploding enemies with acid that are on fire, and vice versa. There's actually a lot to play around with, even within the few elements that are available. The environments also can be toyed with, as I mentioned earlier with the rain. You can also break ice to drop monsters into freezing water, heat yourself up in cold climates by igniting enemies, and freeze water to make traversable paths. Of course, you do have an array of other gadgets and tools like fire grenades, slow motion bubbles, protective barriers, and stuff like that, which can aid you in combat and figuring out how to get through each encounter. So between like the enemy design, the weapons, and the elemental play this game is going for, it all actually comes together to make a really enjoyable experience that looks rather shallow on surface, but the more you play, the deeper it gets, which unfortunately brings me to my biggest hangup about Scars Above, and that it's short. I finished Scars Above in one sitting, just about 6 hours, but I'm also not on the highest difficulty, so I may go back and play it again on the hardest. And just to point it out there, there's nothing wrong with a short experience. A great 6-hour game will definitely have a better lasting impression than a bad 12-hour one. And while I do say I don't like that Scars Above is short, it's because I actually want more. I enjoyed it that much that I just want to play more of it and have more to do in the game. So, to me it's a con, but it's also a pro, right? Now, of course, Scars Above being short also comes with other issues, and that it really doesn't have much enemy diversity, unfortunately. I think there's only about 5 enemies in the game with different elemental variances, so you just shoot them with different elements at times. So if the game was longer, I feel like the lack of enemy variety would become more of a problem, unless, of course, they start adding more enemies, and then that's just, more game, more DLC, whatever you want to call it. I just want more of everything, essentially. But right now, I feel like the proportions of like the enemy variety and the time of the game do kind of match up. Unfortunately, though, even the final boss was also just a variance on like the first mini boss we fought, which was a huge letdown, and kind of spoiled the otherwise fine campaign for me. Like, we didn't even get to fight like the big baddie in the end. We fought like a proxy thing, so kind of a shame there. But all in all, I think Scars Above is actually a well-executed experience, and I feel the time was justified. I think the $35 price tag is probably a little high for some people, for at least a title this short. I mean, if it goes on sale for like $25 or so, I'd say go for it for sure. But in my experience, it's just a little pricey, but I'm sure $10 also doesn't matter to most people. Again, though, it's got some really solid and unique gunplay, and I really liked it. It's got great visuals, so yeah, I mean, I definitely recommend it for sure. Just do note that it is going to be a rather short experience. But that's going to be all for me, so thank you all for watching, and thank you to my Patreon members as well. Love you all. If anyone wants to talk shop about games, feel free to join my Discord in the description below, but yeah, thanks and good luck out there.